Welcome back. Still here with us is Eddie Yu, the Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. Thank you so much for staying with us. You did briefly mention before the break, issues around privacy and, say, for example, CBDC. I did want to get your thoughts on another privacy element that I wanted to get to, which was concerns around the Commercial Data Interchange, or the CDI. While it's great to be able to have all this data that's easily accessible by financial institutions, there is a concern that it's basically having it's basically a centralized platform where all the information is stored, which could make it a bit, I suppose, in some sense, volatile to any kind of risks. How are you looking to address that moving forward? And are there any concerns that maybe a decentralized system to sort of hold people's data would have been better, perhaps?
Well, there are several points I want to make. The first is a clarification. The CDI concept is actually just like what the name implies. It's a commercial data interchange. It's actually a platform that facilitates the travel of data from the data source to the banks. It does not actually store any data there, basically because of the reasons that you talk about, security, data privacy, etc. So in future, if there's a lot of data providers that are plugged into the system, and if on the other side, the banks are also plugged into the system, if the banks initiate a request with the consent of the data owner, then through this CDI, you can draw or get the data that you need from different sources in a very efficient way through the CDI into the bank. So the CDI itself does not store any data. That's one. And second, privacy is an important element to ensure that the success of the CDI. 2 points here. One is that whenever data is drawn from any data source, the consent of the data owner is important, is needed. So the bank has to get the consent from the data owner for them to draw these data from different sources. Currently, it's very cumbersome because there's no multi-to-multi linkage. So the banks are doing that on a bilateral basis, and they need to do a lot of bilateral agreements and links, and they need to get the consent from the data owners many times before they can get all the data that they need. But in future, you only need the data owner to consent once for them to draw data from different sources. And that actually benefits the data owner, because through the use of all these data, the bank can actually use data as the driving force for credit assessment, instead of relying on collateral to extend loans to the borrowers, especially for the SMEs, who do not always have collateral to back up their borrowing. So data is actually something that they can use in future. But of course, if the data owner does not want to release these data to the banks, they can just refuse the consent. And the other point I want to make is actually related to this, is the idea is that if the SME, if the corporate is the owner of all these data, should they themselves have the flexibility to mobilize these data for their own use? As I said, using this data actually benefit themselves. So if they can, in a way, get their own digital footprint and put it to the bank, so that the banks can extend loans to them either without collateral or more cheaply because of their data footprint. Because, for example, their data footprint suggests that they are secure borrowers, then it actually benefits them. So that's actually the idea of CDI. But privacy is important, and we are actually, when developing the CDI, we have been in close touch with the Privacy Commission to make sure that the various process that we put into the CDI operation is in compliance with the relevant legislation, including the personal data privacy legislation here. They have been involved all along.
You mentioned SMEs a couple of times. Is that one of the business areas that you've identified as being underdeveloped and in need of support through the CDI?
Yes, the SME lending is one area that we're targeting at. And currently, sometimes it's a bit hard for SMEs to get loans from the banks without the need for collateral. And very often, when the economic climate turns, many of these SME loans get recalled, mainly because the banks are worried about the risk. Whether some of these SMEs, whether their orders are still there, whether the kind of trade that they're having with the other party is still there. But what we are hoping is that with more data available to the banks, one, the extension of loans will be easier. If, for example, for a trade company, if the bank can get the trade declarations directly from the data source, knowing who the SME is dealing with, the credit worthiness of their counterparties, or even in future, when connecting with the E-Trade Connect platform, they roughly know, where the trade process is, whether the goods have been delivered, etc. Then the banks can actually have more confidence in their lending to the SMEs, thereby reducing the cost or maybe obviating the need for collateral. And maybe even during times of turmoil, they will be a bit more confident to continue some of these loans for the SMEs.
Switching gears for a second, I did want to go back to the cross-border interactions between Hong Kong and the mainland and focus on the bond connect actually that you have currently going on, which essentially allows investors to trade in each other's jurisdiction or at least in each other's bond market. Obviously, the southbound leg of the bond connect opened up pretty recently, and it allowed mainland banks and investors to trade in Hong Kong. First day of trading saw upwards of $600 million US dollars worth of transactions, but the majority of the interest seems to be in green bonds. But despite that, the Hong Kong bond market is still seen as relatively small. Will the volume of green bonds available be enough to satiate mainland demand that is obviously looking for something sizable to invest in? And will there be a push to incorporate more U.S. bonds, which some analysts have suggested are more in demand with mainland investors?
Well, one is that the Hong Kong bond market is actually not as small as people thought. It's a kind of perception issue. If you look at the development of the bond market, the issuance of the issuance of bonds in Hong Kong has actually been increasing quite rapidly in the recent years. In terms of international issuance in Asia, Hong Kong is actually the largest, especially with the G3 currencies, including the US dollar bonds. And I think you're right in that by having the southbound leg of the Bond Connect, we're actually having an additional investor base, which is the institutional investors in China. And yes, their awareness about green bonds, because green bond market is actually quite developed in China already. Their awareness and interest in green bonds is actually large. And I do expect that with the continued development of the Bond Connect southbound link, there will be more incentive for different issuers, whether they're international or Chinese issuers, coming to the Hong Kong platform to issue bonds here in order to reach this additional or new investor base arising from the Bond Connect. And some of that will actually be green bonds because of the interest. And we've got the ecosystem to satisfy the needs. In fact, if you look at the green bond market in Hong Kong, last year, the issuance of green bond in Hong Kong is about 12 billion US dollars. And this year, in just the first 6 months, the green bond issuance in Hong Kong has already surpassed that number. And so the increase is actually quite significant. And we also expect that there will be more mainland institutions coming here to issue because of their own transition to carbon neutrality. Especially, in particular, we're very glad that for the recent Shenzhen municipal government issuance in Hong Kong, it's the first time that any local government is issuing in RMB bond offshore. And it's the first time that they are issuing RMB bond in the green bond area. Of the 5 billion RMB issuance of the Shenzhen government, about, I think it's 3.9 billion is actually green bonds. And we do hope that it will bring a demonstrative effect for the other GBA corporations to follow suit, come to Hong Kong, issue bonds here, especially the green bonds, to satisfy not only the mainland investors' interest, but also international investors' interest. And by the way, there's one additional point that I would like to say is that the Bond Connect southbound leg is only really has just taken off. It's only a beginning. As with the other Connect schemes, the takeoff is more gradual, the scope is more narrow, but after it's run for a period of time in a smooth and orderly way, there is actually scope to expand it. One area is actually US dollar bonds. Currently, under the Bond Connect, the scope is only confined to RMB and Hong Kong dollar bonds. But we believe that the next step has to be US dollar bonds, including US dollar green bonds.
Obviously, the northbound leg has been open since 2017. What are some takeaways that you've seen have worked for the opening of the southbound leg, and what do you think can be improved on?
Well, one thing that we've learned from the different Connect schemes is that you have to really make sure that these breakthroughs, these capital account opening, is done in a gradual, orderly, and risk-controlled way. You need to have a good start, a smooth start, in order for it to be expanded in a later stage. And you can see that for the Stock Connect, in that we're still trying to expand the scope of the scheme in different ways. The same for Northbound Connect in terms of the scope and the investors. And the same will be done for Southbound. Currently, the traffic is not as heavy, but it's only the beginning. It's now implemented in a smooth, orderly way, and we can then look into the future path, which can actually imply many possibilities, like US dollar bonds. And that, I think, will also help develop Hong Kong further as an issuance center.
Eddie Yu, obviously we have a lot more to get to, but thank you so much for your time and for your insight.
Thank you very much, Drew.
All right, that's it from us here on All About Money. We'll see you again next week.